This video is partially a follow-up to my previous video about Nintendo, link in the description below. The video in the background is a Sega and From Software game called Chromehounds, running on Xenia Canary. I chose it as an example of a fairly modern game that demonstrates the need for game preservation. Nintendo has filed a lawsuit against the developers of a Nintendo Switch emulator, Yuzu. This has ignited a familiar discussion between proponents and opponents of console emulation. I'd like to offer my perspective on the matter and why I believe Nintendo's lawsuit is mostly without merit. First of all, if you aren't aware, emulation is a process of implementing the behavior of a hardware device in software, allowing an indirect way to run other software without porting it. If you've ever played original PlayStation games on a PS3 or played various old game collections like the Sonic Mega Collection, you've probably used emulation without even knowing it. Since emulation allows us to replace old hardware with software, it's especially useful in playing games for long dead consoles. My Game Gear has dead capacitors right now, and a lot of the controllers from my old systems are wearing out. But I can still play games I remember playing as a kid on other machines that still work, thanks to emulation. On a side note, there's actually a market in 2024 for modern consoles that play old games via emulation. Some of these only play ROMs, but others actually have cartridge slots on them to read games from their classic media. Nobody really questions the validity of a preservation argument for old games, but what about more recent ones? The game you're seeing in the background is an Xbox 360 game, trapped by exclusivity and written off by the developer as not profitable. It will probably never get a port or a sequel. Lots of games modern enough that you might not have associated them with console emulation will eventually die out for the same reasons. Emulation allows for old games to gain modern features like netplay, save states, and higher resolution. Since emulators generally don't exclude games with mods, they're sometimes the only option for playing foreign games that were translated by third parties. Finally, emulation allows many games and systems to be combined into one convenient package. That keychain handheld I showed a picture of earlier plays games from more than 11 systems, and has enough storage space for pretty much my entire classic library. The recent news regarding Yuzu is that Nintendo is suing them for alleged violations related to the DMCA. Why now? Has Yuzu been in Nintendo's reach all along? I think not. In fact, Yuzu may still survive this lawsuit intact. Since most games follow a similar pattern of selling well at launch and gradually tapering off, developers are most concerned about piracy when a game is still new. Nintendo is no exception. I'm sure the Zelda leak attracted plenty of attention from Nintendo's brass. This was followed by the DMCA takedown of the Lockpick utility on GitHub. Lockpick was targeted, but Yuzu wasn't because Yuzu is on a fairly solid legal foundation. Media shifting and emulation are protected by precedents in the US legal system. This is why there are lots of emulators and recreation consoles in circulation in 2024. Major losses of Sony against Bleem and Universal set two of these precedents. Without getting too deep in the legal weeds, providing users with an alternative way to enjoy their copyrighted content is legal as long as the users legitimately own it. Yuzu has mostly been safe because it benefited from the Sony v. Bleem precedent. Yuzu doesn't ship commercial games to users, nor does it ship the encryption key required to play them. Yuzu's website avoids references to pirate websites, or even to the tools needed to access the encryption keys. Nintendo's lawsuit argues that distant references on the Yuzu Discord are helping people to find the Lockpick software, and that the emulator itself is tainted because it contains the ability to use the key to play encrypted games. Even though emulation is legal, Nintendo seeks to paint Yuzu as more relevant in the context of circumvention than game preservation. The Bleem case is especially relevant here because it ended with a precedent that protects emulation, but it also spelled the end for the company developing it. Sony just kept suing until the developers of Bleem ran out of money. So they effectively still killed Bleem in spite of the law being on its side. Whether this will ultimately happen to Yuzu remains to be seen. I think Nintendo's case will succeed or fail on whether Yuzu's access to encrypted content is considered fair use. Since the courts have protected TiVo for time shifting, Betamax for media shifting, Diamond Media for dumping data from commercial CDs, and even Bleem on the grounds that the consumer's rights cover their activities, I think Yuzu's defense is probably strong. Nintendo Switch adopted an ARM platform barely different from ubiquitous Android handhelds, with plenty of documentation and support software. This means that emulation of commercial Switch games was only a matter of time. Emulators like Yuzu arrived while Switch was still actively maintained, and while new games were still being officially released. Nintendo has historically assumed that their games won't work on unapproved devices for many years, perhaps ever, because their systems are quirky. The Wii had motion controls, the DS had 2 screens, and so on. However, other than barely used motion control features, the Switch doesn't really have any of the same gotchas. The Switch's off-the-shelf manufacturing doesn't benefit from this type of security by obscurity. Development of Yuzu was announced just 10 months after the Switch was released. It took a while for commercial games to work, but eventually they did. That means the Switch's game exclusivity has been challenged for most of its lifespan. Not only did a lot of major titles like the Let's Go Pikachu and Let's Go Eevee games play on Yuzu within days of release, but Zelda Tears of the Kingdom actually worked on Yuzu before the official release, because the game was leaked 2 weeks prior to launch day. We already know a lot about the processor that the next Nintendo console will use. It appears that Nintendo is barely changing the Switch hardware. They will still be using an ARM processor manufactured by Nvidia, which may even be binary compatible with existing Switch games. It seems like a foregone conclusion that the next Switch would be emulated by programs like Yuzu very quickly, perhaps sooner than the Switch was. I think the most likely reason why Nintendo is taking a new shot at Yuzu is that they have decided not to engage in more aggressive hardware measures to secure games, and think that legal maneuvers to shore up the Switch will make the early days of the Switch 2 more profitable. They might even want to re-release Switch games as remasters and think that the value of those projects in the future depends on clamping down on Yuzu now. As a consumer, Nintendo's legal flailing does not give me a reason to buy a Switch. Frankly, it makes me think that they are approaching consoles the wrong way. Like I said in my last video about them, Nintendo's business model is no longer working. In 2024, handhelds may be considered obsolete in 2 years or less, and are expected to serve a variety of functions. Nintendo is still tying their games to devices with greater than 5-year lifespans which can't even browse the web, much less compete with the feature sets of tablets or PCs. The fact that players already play Nintendo's games in emulators shows that demand for the games is a lot healthier than demand for Nintendo's consoles. Eventually, Nintendo will see the writing on the wall the same way other companies in gaming and media have. What we still don't know is how long Nintendo will remain in denial, or what else they will do to throw their weight around in the meantime. Hopefully Yuzu will remain available and this will all blow over. Thanks for watching.